Imagine walking through a forest 45,000 years ago and seeing something that shouldn't exist. A figure in the distance, upright, using tools, building a fire, but not quite you. Heavier brow, wider chest, shorter, thicker limbs built for a colder, harsher world. For a moment, you don't know if you're looking at a person or a threat. This wasn't a myth. This wasn't a legend passed down around a fire. This actually happened. Not once, but over and over, in different places at different times for thousands of years. Two separate branches of the human family, walking the same forests, drinking from the same rivers, sometimes within sight of each other. And what happened in those moments shaped who ended up surviving and who didn't. Today, when you think of human, you think of one species, us. Everyone on Earth right now belongs to the same genetic family, no matter where they're from. But that's actually strange. For almost all of human history, that wasn't true. Multiple human species existed on this planet at the same time. And for a long stretch, they weren't just aware of each other. They were neighbors. So what actually happened when they crossed paths? Not the sanitized textbook version, the real one. Let's start with where. Around 45,000 years ago, Homo sapiens began pushing north out of Africa into Europe and Western Asia. That territory wasn't empty. Neanderthals had already been living there for over 300,000 years. They knew the terrain. They knew which caves stayed dry, which rivers froze first, which animals to avoid in winter. And suddenly, a new kind of human was showing up in their world, uninvited. For a long time, scientists assumed these two groups barely interacted, maybe glimpsed each other from a distance, maybe avoided one another entirely. But that theory fell apart the moment researchers sequenced ancient DNA. Because buried in the genome of nearly everyone with non-African ancestry, today is a small percentage, usually 1 to 2%, of Neanderthal DNA. That's not a coincidence. That's proof of contact. Real, physical, reproductive contact. These weren't just two species passing each other in the woods. At some point, they were close enough and comfortable enough to have children together. Now think about what that actually required. Not one encounter, not a single accidental meeting. For that DNA to spread the way it did, there had to be repeated contact over generations across different regions, which means somewhere in the historical record that never got written down, there were relationships. There was trust. There may have even been mixed families, half Neanderthal, half Homo sapiens children, growing up inside one group or the other, carrying two different evolutionary histories in a single body. But contact wasn't always peaceful. It couldn't have been. Both species needed the same things to survive, the same herds to hunt, the same caves to shelter in, the same rivers for water. When resources are limited and two intelligent tool-using species are competing for them, conflict isn't a possibility. It's almost guaranteed. There's skeletal evidence from certain sites showing trauma patterns that don't match hunting accidents or animal attacks, blunt force injuries, defensive wounds, the kind of damage that suggests violence between individuals, not between species necessarily, but between people who happen to belong to different ones. So the honest answer is both. Sometimes these encounters ended in cooperation, or at least tolerance close enough to result in children. Other times they ended in bloodshed. Humans, both kinds, have never been simple, and there's no reason to think their first meetings were either. But here's the part that actually explains what happened next, and it isn't about violence at all. It's about numbers and networks. Neanderthals lived in small, tight-knit groups, often isolated from other Neanderthal communities by mountains, rivers, or sheer distance. Their genetic diversity was low, dangerously low, which tells us their populations were already thin before Homo sapiens ever arrived. When a hard winter hit or disease spread through a group, there wasn't always another Neanderthal community close enough to help replace what was lost. Homo sapiens operated differently. Our ancestors built wider social networks that stretched across huge distances. Groups that had never met still exchanged tools, techniques, even mates hundreds of kilometers apart. That meant knowledge didn't die with one bad season. If one group figured out a better way to make a spear point or track migrating herds, that information could travel outward, pass from person to person, group to group, long after the original inventor was gone. So picture two neighboring groups, one Homo sapiens, one Neanderthal, both facing the same brutal winter. The Homo sapiens group has trade contacts 3 valleys over who can share food or knowledge. The Neanderthal group has no one. That difference, repeated across thousands of winters, thousands of droughts, thousands of small crises, adds up to something enormous over time. And the climate wasn't cooperating either. This period wasn't stable. Ice ages advanced and retreated. Forests turned to tundra and back again. Every shift forced both species to adapt or move, and adapting requires exactly the kind of flexible, far-reaching cooperation that Neanderthal groups increasingly couldn't manage. There's also the question of competition for the same prey. Isotope analysis of Neanderthal bones shows they were heavily dependent on large game, mammoths, rhinos, big herbivores that required close-range, high-risk hunting. Homo sapiens diets were more varied: fish, birds, smaller game, plants. That flexibility mattered enormously when large animal populations started declining. A species that can only eat one type of food starves when that food disappears. A species that eats almost anything survives the same collapse. None of this means Homo sapiens marched in and wiped Neanderthals out in some dramatic final battle. That's not what the evidence shows. There's no mass grave, no single war that ended it. What the evidence shows is slower and, honestly, sadder. Small groups getting smaller, isolated bands losing contact with neighbors. Winters that used to be survivable becoming lethal because there was no wider network to lean on. Meanwhile, Homo sapiens kept expanding, kept connecting, kept trading knowledge across a growing web of communities. By around 40,000 years ago, Neanderthal populations had shrunk to isolated pockets, mostly in the far south of Europe, and then, slowly, even those disappeared from the fossil record entirely. But they didn't vanish completely. Not really. Every time a Homo sapiens today gets a cold, their immune response might partly rely on genes inherited from Neanderthals. Some of the DNA in modern humans linked to skin and hair traits traces directly back to those encounters tens of thousands of years ago. There's even evidence that certain Neanderthal gene variants affect how some people respond to viruses right now in the present day. In a very real, measurable sense, Neanderthals are still here. Not as a separate species anymore, but folded permanently into us. And Neanderthals weren't the only ones. Homo sapiens also crossed paths with Denisovans in Asia, leaving genetic traces that still show up today in populations across Oceania and the Tibetan Plateau. Multiple encounters, multiple outcomes, multiple species quietly absorbed into the genome of the one species that kept expanding. So what actually happened when two human species met? Sometimes it was violent, sometimes it was intimate. Most of the time it was probably neither dramatic conflict nor romance, just two groups of people aware of each other, competing for the same shrinking resources in a changing world, occasionally crossing paths closely enough to leave something behind. Homo sapiens didn't win because we were smarter. Neanderthals had bigger brains on average. We didn't win because we were stronger. Neanderthal bodies were built for a level of physical stress ours never had to handle. What may have actually decided it was something much less obvious: the ability to stay connected to people we'd never even met. A network that outlasted any single bad year, any single lost generation. The next time someone tells you that you're 100% human, in the simplest possible sense, that's not quite true. Look closely enough at your own DNA, and you'll find the echo of a meeting that happened tens of thousands of years ago between two different kinds of people who, for a while, shared the same world.